The rain came down hard against the glass walls of the penthouse on the 40th floor of Gale Tower in Midtown Manhattan. Not the soft rain of an autumn evening, the kind of rain that finds every seam in every window frame and reminds you that glass, however thick, is still just glass. Wren Hale had been living in the basement of this building for 87 days. She knew the rain before it arrived. She knew it by the way the pipes above her sleeping spot groaned an hour before the first drop fell, by the way the air pressure in the ventilation shaft changed and pushed warm kitchen air down through the grate above her cardboard bed in long, uneven pulses. She had learned to read this building the way other children learn to read picture books. Slowly at first, then faster, then without thinking at all. She was 7 years old. She had been on her own for 1 year, 2 months, and 4 days. She kept count because her mother had taught her that numbers were honest when people were not. Her mother had taught her many things. Celeste Hale had been a translator by profession and a teacher by nature, and she had understood in the particular way that women who have survived difficult circumstances understand things that the world would offer her daughter very little protection. So she had given Wren the only armor she knew how to forge. Language. Russian, because her own mother had come from St. Petersburg and spoken it at the kitchen table every morning until the day she died. German, because her father had come from Dresden and believed that a person who could not argue in 2 languages could not argue properly in 1. Italian, because of a summer in Rome when Wren was 4 years old, and Celeste had watched her daughter absorb the sounds around her the way dry earth absorbs rain effortlessly, completely, without waste. English, because they lived in America, and English was the river everything else flowed into. 5 languages in the mind of a 7-year-old girl who had learned them the way children learn everything truly important, not from books, but from the voice of someone who loved her. Celeste had also taught her daughter one other thing, and she had said it on a Tuesday evening in their apartment in the Bronx, sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold while she was thinking about how to say what she needed to say. She had said language is the only thing a person can carry that no one can take away from them. Money can be taken. A house can be burned. The words inside your head belong to you alone. Wren had not understood all of what that meant when her mother said it. She understood it now. 1 year ago, Celeste Hale did not come home from a drive to a meeting outside Albany. A policeman came to their door the following morning and told Wren in the careful, flat voice that policemen use when they are delivering news to children that there had been an accident, that a car had gone off a road near a bridge, that her mother was gone. He said it 3 times in 3 different ways, the way adults do when they believe repetition softens things. But what Wren remembered from that night was not the policeman. What she remembered was earlier. What she remembered was 2 men in black coats who had come to the apartment before the policeman, before anyone official, before any of the careful, flat voices. She had been in bed. She had not been asleep. She had heard the front door open, and she had done what her mother had told her to do when she heard the front door open after 9 at night, which was to go to the closet behind the hanging dresses and stay there and be very quiet. She had stayed there for a long time after the two men left. She had heard them talking to each other in English in the low, satisfied tone of men who have finished a task and are not troubled by it. One of them had said, "It is done." She had no family, nothing to clean up after. Wren had stayed in the closet until the sun came up. She had counted the dresses by touch in the dark 17 of them, and she had held the stuffed bear her mother had sent to a repair shop in order to have the neck seam fixed, the one with the cream ribbon tied carefully around its throat. And she had not made a sound because her mother had told her that the closet behind the dresses was the safest place, and she believed everything her mother had told her. After that, there had been a woman in Yonkers who was supposed to be family, but was not really, not in any way that mattered. Then there had been a man in Patterson who had paid $900 for Wren, the way a person pays for a thing they intend to use rather than a person they intend to know. She had run the night before that man's plans came into motion, and she had been running in one form or another ever since. She had found the basement of Gale Tower in September. The steam pipe in the northwest corner ran warm from October through March. The ventilation shaft that connected the basement to the private dining room on the 38th floor carried sound in both directions, and the gap in the kitchen delivery schedule on Tuesday and Thursday mornings meant that no one checked the service entrance between 5 and 6 in the morning, which was when Wren had first slipped inside. She did not steal. This was important to her. It was something her mother would have cared about, and Wren still organized her life around the things her mother would have cared about, because it was the only structure she had left. The bread from the bakery 2 blocks south belonged in a different category. The woman who ran that bakery, a tall woman with flour permanently worked into the creases of her hands, whose name Wren had learned was Tatum Brierly, left rolls on the cooling rack beside the window that faced the alley. She left them there every morning. She never looked to see if they were taken. Wren had concluded, after several weeks of observation, that Tatum Brierly knew exactly where those rolls went and had made a private decision to keep not knowing. This was a form of kindness that Wren had learned to recognize. It looked like carelessness, but it was not. She had been living in the basement for 87 days when she heard the conversation that changed everything. It was a Thursday. The rain had not started yet, but the pipes were already groaning their warning. Wren was lying on her cardboard beside the steam pipe, with the bear tucked under her chin, listening to the ventilation shaft, the way she listened to it every evening, which was the way her mother had taught her to listen to any language she did not yet fully know, completely, without trying to translate every word as it arrived, letting it move through her like water, trusting that the meaning would settle at the bottom when the current stopped. The men in the dining room above were speaking Russian. This was not unusual. Men in that dining room spoke Russian often. They also spoke in English in a kind of coded English that used ordinary words to mean other things, and occasionally in German, which was when they spoke most freely, because they had apparently concluded that no one in a Manhattan dining room above a criminal organization's private kitchen spoke German. Wren had made no effort to correct this assumption. But tonight, the Russian was different. Tonight, the Russian was not the careful diplomatic Russian of men in a formal meeting. It was the fast-dropped consonant assumption heavy Russian of men who believe they are entirely alone, and what Wren heard moving through the shaft in that loose, unguarded current stopped her breathing for the span of 4 or 5 seconds. A man named Casper. She had heard his name before, always said with a specific weight that told her he was important, the way powerful men are important, not because of what they do, but because of what they cause to happen to other people. He was confirming something, a delivery, a time, a location, Red Hook Pier, 3 in the morning, a word that meant warmth but did not mean warmth. And then another voice, slightly lower, speaking in Russian with the faint clipped quality of a man who learned it as an adult rather than a child, agreeing, confirming. And then a sound that Wren had catalogued after weeks of listening to the men above her, the sound this particular voice made when it found something privately satisfying, a short sound, half a breath, half a note. She had heard that voice many times. She knew who it belonged to. She had never learned his name, but she had built a picture of him from sound alone, from the way his footsteps on the dining room floor above her were always measured, and even from the way he shifted between languages mid-sentence to emphasize a point, from the way he laughed at things that were not funny, in rooms where the other men laughed because he did. She lay on her cardboard in the dark for a long time after the voices moved away from the dining room. She thought about her mother. She thought about what her mother had said about language being the only key that could not be taken. She thought about the fact that she was currently in possession of 5 keys, and the man 40 floors above her head was about to walk into a room where he would have none. She had been thinking about this since Monday. She had been thinking about it with the particular slow thoroughness that children apply to decisions they understand are serious. She knew what she was considering was dangerous. She knew she could be removed from the building, turned over to authorities, handed back to systems that had already failed to protect her once. She knew the man 40 floors above her was not a good man in any ordinary sense of the word, but she also knew that 2 men had stood in her mother's apartment and said the words she had memorized and carried for a year, and what she had heard tonight in the ventilation shaft sounded in its structure, in its tone, in the satisfied weight of the voice that confirmed it, like the beginning of another night that would end the same way. She put on the oversized wool coat. It had been left in the basement storage room in March and had not been claimed since. It was 2 full sizes too large for her, and she had folded the sleeves back 4 times, and they still covered half her hands. She tucked the bear under her left arm, the one with the cream ribbon around its neck, the one her mother had had repaired at a shop, because the seam at the neck was coming apart, and Wren carried it everywhere. She walked to the service corridor door that connected the basement to the upper floors. She had used this door before many times always, in the direction of downward and invisible. She opened it and walked upward. She heard Tatum Brierly's voice first, coming from somewhere behind her on the landing, offering apologies she had not been asked to offer. Her hands still white with flour, her face already doing the work of a person who has decided that if the next 30 seconds go badly, she will accept the consequences rather than the alternative. Wren did not wait for Tatum to finish. She walked through the conference room door and found herself in a room full of men who looked at her the way men like that look at things that do not belong, which is to say, with the particular alertness of people who have learned that unexpected things in their vicinity require immediate response. She looked at none of them. She looked at the man at the head of the table. Rowan Gale was 48 years old, and he had the face of a person who had made a practice of not being surprised, who had quietly closed the door on surprise years ago on the reasonable assumption that it simply no longer applied to him. He had dark hair going gray at the left temple. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had been made by someone who understood how to make a suit for a man who needed to appear completely at ease in rooms where nothing was at ease. His eyes were gray, and they were looking at her with the absolute stillness he reserved for things that required his entire attention. A bodyguard closed the distance between himself and Wren in 3 steps, with the certainty of a large person removing a small obstacle. The man at the head of the table said one word. It was not a loud word. It did not need to be. It had the quality of a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple reached every corner of the room before the sound itself finished. The bodyguard stopped. Wren looked up at Rowan Gale, and in a voice that barely carried above the hum of the ventilation system, she said the words she had been preparing since Monday. "Sir, I speak Russian. I heard you in the hallway. I can help." From somewhere to the left of the table came a laugh, one note too loud, one beat too quick. Several of the other men allowed themselves to laugh with it, glancing toward the head of the table first for permission, the way men in that room always glanced toward the head of the table for permission before committing to a feeling. The older man near the window with the silver hair and the cane did not laugh. He looked at the man who had laughed. Then he looked at Wren. Rowan Gale did not laugh. He moved, slowly, with the measured deliberateness of a man who does not waste motion. He came around the end of the table and lowered himself into a crouch in front of her until the expensive Italian leather of his shoes met the peeling rubber sole of her sneaker, and his gray eyes and her blue ones were at exactly the same level. He studied her for a moment that had no particular hurry in it. Then he chose his words carefully. Not a greeting, not a simple phrase she might have picked up from a travel guide or a classroom. He chose something long and tangled and specific, thick with Moscow slang, built around a proverb his grandfather had taught him on a fire escape in Hell's Kitchen when Rowan was 8 years old, and the neighborhood was still the kind of place where people passed things down in person because writing them down felt too permanent. He said it in Russian: "A wolf can change his coat, but never his nature." And the man who forgets that lesson ends up feeding the forest before the first snow comes. The laughter in the room died in sections, not all at once, the way a fire goes out when the wood beneath it has been quietly used up. Wren tilted her head. It was the movement of someone hearing a piece of music they recognize in a place they were not expecting to encounter it. Then she answered in English as clear and unaccented as water running over stone. "You said a wolf can change his fur, but never what he is underneath. Any man who forgets that ends up feeding the forest before winter comes. It is a proverb. My mother said it when she did not trust someone." The silence that arrived after that had physical weight. Rowan Gale looked at her for a long time without speaking. The particular stillness in his face was the kind that men develop when they have learned that expression is a form of information they cannot afford to give away freely. But underneath it, in the 2 seconds before the stillness fully reasserted itself, she saw something move, something old, something that had not been expecting to be disturbed. He said, "How old are you?" She said 7. He looked at his watch. He had 3 minutes before the elevator arrived. 3 minutes was not enough time to understand how a child in a coat that had never fit her had come to be standing in his conference room, speaking a proverb that had no business being in any mouth except his own family's. 3 minutes was enough time to make a decision. He stood. He snapped his fingers once. A man named Luca came forward from the wall with a cushion from the sofa in the adjacent lounge. Rowan pointed to the chair at his immediate left, the chair where Owen Pratt was supposed to be sitting, the chair that had been empty since 6 that morning. He said, "Put her there. Raise it." Then he turned back to Wren, and his voice dropped into the register he used when he needed something to be understood completely and immediately, and without the requirement of repetition. He said, "You are going to sit in that chair. You are going to translate every word they say to me in English, and every word I say back to them in Russian. If you do it correctly, you walk out of here with more money than you have ever seen. If you do it wrong, whether by mistake or by choice, we both die in this room. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She nodded once, the nod of a person who has been asked serious questions before and has developed the habit of answering them seriously. Rowan turned toward his seat. He had taken exactly 1 step when he felt it, the lightest possible pull on the fabric of his jacket sleeve, less than a tap. The weight of something very small making contact with something much larger and simply holding on. He stopped. He looked down. Her fingers had caught the edge of his cuff. She had shifted languages entirely without announcement, the way a person reaches for a different tool when the one in their hand cannot do the work required. What came out of her mouth was Italian spoken in a soft Roman cadence that belonged to a neighborhood and a generation, and a kind of closeness that only exists between people who learned a language together in a small space. She said in that Italian and that voice, "They are going to kill you. Tonight. Not the Russians alone, one of your own men. I heard them outside the elevator twice." The man on your side laughed when they finished talking. Rowan Gale's entire body went cold. Not the cold of shock. The deeper descending cold of a man hearing a sentence he has already half known was coming, but had not yet permitted himself to fully believe. He did not move. He did not look down at her again. He kept his face precisely where it had been, which was the face of a composed man in a difficult room, because there were 6 men watching him, and at least one of them was watching for exactly this, for the first tremor of alarm that would tell him his timing was right. Rowan tilted his head slightly, as though adjusting his collar, and spoke back to her in the same low Italian through a mouth that barely moved. "Who?" Her fingers did not release his sleeve. She said they used a code. "The crow flies at 3. I heard it outside the elevator. The man from your side laughed when they said it. Every muscle across Rowan Gale's back went to iron. He allowed himself 1 second, 1 measured second, during which he let his eyes cross the room, as though simply counting chairs. They settled on the man to his left, without appearing to settle anywhere. The man in the navy suit, who had been with him for 12 years, and whose face had been constructed from those years, the way a mask is constructed for a wearer who has long since forgotten he is wearing one. That man was sweating, not visibly, not in any way a stranger would notice. But Rowan had watched this face through 12 years of situations that would have dissolved most people, and this man did not sweat in a room set to 68 degrees, unless something was already in motion that he could not stop. Rowan looked back at the girl. He arranged his expression into something indulgent, something soft and unbothered, in the way of a wealthy man who has decided to find a lost child charming. He said to her in that same register, that same almost motionless voice, "What else have you heard?" She said, "I have been living in your basement, the one with the boiler room and the steam pipe. The ventilation carries voices from the dining room on 38. I have been listening for almost 3 months. I do not steal, only bread from the bakery across the street. The woman there knows. She pretends she does not." He said, "What have you heard?" She began to recite. She said the phrases the way a child recites something learned by heart. No emphasis, no interpretation. Only the clean accuracy of a mind that had stored them precisely as received. The crow flies at 3. The red lamp is lit. The chessboard has fallen. The harvest moves through Baltimore on Tuesday. The saint in Queens is not to be visited until the wake is clean. The older man with the silver hair and the cane, who had been standing near the window, took a half-step backward and caught himself against the edge of the credenza. The color had left his face in a single movement, running from the forehead down. He said the name of the man at the head of the table in a voice scraped raw. Those phrases, those exact phrases. Only 5 people in this organization know those codes. You, me, and 3 others. Rowan said quietly, "I know what it means, August." The intercom at the side of the room buzzed. The receptionist's voice came through, and at its edges was an unsteadiness that should not have been there. "Mr. Gale, they are on their way up." Rowan Gale straightened his tie. He turned once more to the girl who was standing in an oversized coat with a stuffed bear under her arm in the middle of a conference room, 40 floors above a city that had no particular interest in what happened to her. He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Wren. Wren Hale." He had been trained for 20 years to keep his face a surface on which nothing landed visibly. He was grateful in this particular moment for every single one of those years, because inside his chest something moved that had no name he could reach for quickly, something that had been keeping its distance from him for a long time. Hale. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in a year. He had given an order a year ago, and that order had had a name attached to it. A woman's name. A name that had been in his organization for 3 years and had sat 2 chairs to his left and had corrected his grandfather's Russian dialect without making him feel corrected, who had stayed awake for 30 hours in a Boston hotel room, translating a hostage negotiation that ended without a single shot fired, who had been brought to his private study one winter evening by the man in the Navy suit, with papers laid out across the desk in a sequence designed to tell a story. The story was betrayal. The evidence was meticulous. The conclusion was presented to him with the careful gravity of a man who has something terrible to report and has prepared himself to report it cleanly. He had given the smallest nod in the world. 2 days later, the man in the Navy suit had returned with snow still on his shoulders and said, "It is done." She had no family, nothing to clean up after. Rowan looked down at the bear tucked under the girl's arm, at the cream ribbon tied around its neck, at the 2 letters embroidered in gold thread that had faded from years of small hands running over them. C.H. Celeste Hale. He had arranged the repair of that bear himself. The seam at the neck had been coming apart. He remembered making the call. He remembered the shop in the city that did fine needlework, and the instruction he had passed along about the ribbon. He had done this because Celeste Hale had sent him a note that was in retrospect so characteristic of her that it should have told him everything, apologizing for the inconvenience, asking if perhaps someone might know a place that could fix the seam, because her daughter carried this particular bear everywhere, and the stitching was simply not going to hold. He had made the call himself. Bantay ong ruklai koi kongo, nyute rui bangda da bong ong. He straightened. He did not look at the bear again. He did not need to. He moved to his chair at the head of the table and sat down and arranged his hands in front of him and looked at the door, and whatever was moving through him, whatever had broken loose from wherever it had been held and was falling somewhere without a floor, he kept every trace of it entirely off his face. The main conference room door opened. Dmitri Kasper walked in. He was a large man packed into a suit the color of wet concrete. His head was shaved and caught the chandelier light. His smile showed too many teeth to be read as friendly. He moved to his seat with the ease of a man who considers himself to own whatever room he enters, and his pale eyes swept the space in a single practiced pass before arriving at the small figure in the raised chair beside Rowan Gale. One blond eyebrow rose. He said in Russian, "Who is this?" The girl in the oversized coat folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Casper with eyes that held the particular steadiness that takes years of hard experience to either earn or manufacture, and in a voice that carried no particular feeling about the question, she replied to him in clear, quiet Russian, "I am Mr. Gale's translator. His usual one was taken ill this morning." Casper stared at her for a long moment. Then he threw his head back and produced a short barking sound that was technically laughter, and it rattled the crystal on the table. He said in Russian, "A child Gale. You send me a child. Is this an insult or a joke?" Rowan leaned back in his chair and opened his hands in the easy manner of a man discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. He said neither. "I send what works. Shall we discuss the money or my staffing choices?" The girl translated every word into Russian without looking at any face. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Casper's amusement compressed itself into a grudging nod. He opened his leather portfolio and the negotiation began. For 6 minutes it ran cleanly. Casper spoke his terms, and the girl turned them into English with the precision of someone who had never needed to search for a word, who had been handed these languages the way other children are handed toys, and had simply kept them. She rendered tonnage and routes and percentages and offshore structures exactly as they were spoken, and she reversed the current for Rowan's replies with the same seamless accuracy. To Rowan's left, the man in the navy suit drummed a slow, quiet rhythm against his thigh beneath the table. Rowan saw it. He filed it alongside the watch, alongside the sweat, alongside the laugh that had been one note too loud and one beat too quick. Then Casper came to the part that mattered. He leaned forward. He lowered his voice into the range he used when speaking to men he trusted. His Russian became faster and more particular. He was not bothering to slow it down or simplify it because he had no reason to believe anyone in this room could catch it at full speed. He said, "Delivery confirmed at 3 in the morning. Red Hook Pier. My men will greet you warmly." The word warmly was the word they had agreed on. The pier at Red Hook was dark past midnight. The man beside Rowan had been laughing outside the elevator 2 hours earlier. Wren turned her small face toward Rowan Gale. Her blue eyes held his for exactly 1 beat longer than a professional translator's eyes hold a client's. It was the length of a single communicated sentence, and Rowan received it with complete clarity. Then she spoke in bright, unhurried English. "Mr. Casper proposes delivery at 5 in the morning at the main Brooklyn docks. He says his people will receive your team in a friendly manner, with handshakes to seal the new partnership." Wrong time, wrong place, wrong outcome for everyone except the man sitting beside him. Rowan did not blink. He did not look at her. He understood in the space of a single heartbeat what a 7-year-old child had just done, with 14 words in a language that was not her first or second or third. He turned back to Casper with the smile he had been building since he was 19 years old. Excellent. 5 in the morning, Brooklyn. We accept. My people appreciate a warm welcome. Wren translated the acceptance back to Casper in Russian, using the time and location Casper had originally proposed, so that when Casper heard his own plan returned to him, he heard it exactly as he had spoken it, and believed the arrangement was intact at Red Hook at 3 in the morning, just as agreed. Casper nodded with the look of a man who has already spent money he expects to collect. He signed the contract. He shook Rowan's hand with the full ceremony of a man who intends to honor nothing. "See you soon, Rowan." "Soon," Rowan said. The Russians walked out. The door clicked shut. Rowan Gale turned his head slowly toward the small figure seated beside him and raised one finger. "Everybody out." The men moved. The man in the navy suit rose, already reaching for his briefcase, his face arranged into the expression of professional concern. He said, "Rowan, we should debrief. I can stay and walk through the numbers." Rowan said, "Get the cars ready downstairs." Something tightened along the jaw of the man in the navy suit. A calculation was completed behind his eyes, and it concluded that this was not the moment. He walked out with the rest of them, and the door clicked shut for the second time, and the silence that arrived after it was a different quality of silence than the first, heavier, more specific. 3 people remained in the room: Rowan, August, and the girl in the oversized coat. Rowan pulled a chair around and sat facing her, close enough that his knees nearly reached her ruined sneakers. He rested his forearms on his thighs with his hands loose. When he spoke, the voice that came out was one that the men who worked for him had not heard in a long time. He said, "Wren, look at me. Tell me everything, from the beginning." She swallowed. Her hands tightened around the stuffed bear. For the first time since she had come through that service door, the steadiness in her face developed a fracture. And through the fracture, he could see what was underneath, which was a frightened child who had been carrying things that children should not be asked to carry, and who had learned not to show it because showing it had never once made anything easier. She breathed in once, unsteady, and then the words came in a whisper that reached every wall of that room. She told him about the 2 men in the apartment a year ago, about the closet behind her mother's dresses, about staying there until the sun came up, about the words she had memorized and carried every day since it is done. She had no family, nothing to clean up after. She told him about the woman in Yonkers, about the man in Patterson, about running. She told him about the basement of his building, about the steam pipe, about the ventilation shaft, about the bread from the bakery window that Tatum Brierly left where she left it every morning without looking. She told him she had been listening for 3 months, and that the voices carried clearly on certain nights more than others, and that she had understood most of what she heard in most of the languages it was spoken in. August Finn stood behind her and said nothing. His face had gone to a place that August Finn's face rarely went, which was somewhere private and not entirely composed. Rowan looked at the bear under her arm. He reached out slowly, not to take it, only to touch it, only to see. His fingers brushed the cream ribbon at the throat of the bear, and he saw the letters up close now in the light of the conference room chandelier. C.H. He withdrew his hand. He rose without speaking. He did not look at the letters again. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to the room and looked at the rain coming down against the glass and thought about a call he had made a year ago to a shop that did fine needlework and an order he had given 2 days later in a voice he had made himself keep level, and a man who had come back from upstate New York with snow on his shoulders and said those words as though they were a routine report. August came to stand beside him. He did not ask a question. He was 66 years old, and he had been reading Rowan Gale's face for 22 of those years, and he knew that what was on that face right now was not something a question would help. After a moment, Rowan said very quietly the name of the man who had walked out of this room 10 minutes earlier. Beckett. August said yes. Rowan said, "Get her somewhere safe. Not the tower, not tonight." He looked once more at the girl seated in the raised chair at the head of the conference table, the one that should have been occupied by Owen Pratt, who had kissed his daughter on the forehead that morning and walked out his front door and had not been seen since. Wren Hale was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and the bear against her chest and her pale eyes on his face, and she had the look of a person who has delivered what she came to deliver and is now waiting without urgency, without performance, simply waiting to find out what happens next. He thought about what those 2 men had said in her mother's apartment. Nothing to clean up after. He turned away from the window. He said, "August, take the service elevator. Have the blue sedan brought around, not the Mercedes." He said it in the voice he used for things that needed to be the last instruction anyone would ever need on a given matter. August gathered his cane. He placed one large, warm hand on Wren's shoulder and guided her toward the service corridor. Rowan followed 4 steps behind. His eyes stayed on the small figure moving ahead of him in the enormous coat the bear tucked under her arm, the cream ribbon moving slightly with each step. He had given an order a year ago. He was beginning to understand what that order had cost. He was not yet ready to understand all of it, but the first piece of it was walking in front of him in borrowed shoes with a stuffed bear and 5 languages in her head, and she had just saved his life without anyone in that room understanding what she had done or how completely she had done it. The service elevator doors opened. They stepped inside. The doors closed. Rowan Gale looked straight ahead and said nothing, and somewhere in the space between the 40th floor and the ground, in the mechanical quiet of that small descending box, something shifted in him that had not shifted in a very long time. Not peace, not clarity. Something older and quieter than either, something closer to the first moment of acknowledging a thing you have been walking away from when you finally stop moving and turn around and let it find you where you stand. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. They walked out into the rain. The safe house on the Upper East Side was a narrow brownstone that presented nothing to the street. No name on the buzzer, no indication of anything particular about the people who had used it over the years. Inside it was quiet wood and dim gold lamplight, the kind of space designed to look like it had always belonged to a retired professor who collected first editions and forgot to dust them. Vera Tully received them at the door with the calm professionalism of a woman who had been given unusual instructions before and had never found it useful to ask about them. She was 60 years old and had worked for Rowan Gale for 11 years, and she had a gift for making spaces feel inhabited and safe that had nothing to do with decoration and everything to do with the particular quality of attention she brought to a room before anyone else arrived in it. She looked at Wren once, at the oversized coat and the bear and the one sneaker with the lace missing, and then she looked at Rowan, and something passed between them that required no words. A bath, a warm meal, the guest room on the second floor with the window that faced the garden. Wren went with her without argument. At the top of the stairs, she paused and looked back at Rowan, once her pale eyes finding his across the distance of the hallway, with the same directness she had used in the conference room, the same quality of attention that did not perform itself, but simply was. Then Vera guided her gently around the corner, and a door closed between them. Rowan stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked to the library and locked the door behind him. August was already there, seated in the chair beside the cold fireplace with his cane across his knees and a glass of water he had not touched on the small table beside him. He had the look of a man who has been sitting with something difficult for long enough that he has stopped trying to make it easier to sit with. Rowan crossed to the bookshelf. He reached behind the second row of leather-bound volumes he had inherited and never read, and found the brass lever that released the panel. The wall swung open on a mechanism that had been installed before he took ownership of the building and had never needed improvement. Inside were passports and bearer bonds and a silenced pistol and a manila envelope that was older than anything else in the safe. He took out the envelope. He sat in the chair across from August and opened it. The photograph that slid into his palm showed a woman on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Her hair was the color of pale ash, pushed up under a pair of sunglasses she was wearing as a headband. She was 31 years old in the picture. She had been born in Germany and raised in Russia, and she spoke 7 languages, and for 3 years she had been the most essential person in the Gale organization, who was not technically part of it. Celeste Hale. She had sat 2 chairs to his left at every significant meeting for 3 years. She had been the instrument through which he conducted the most delicate negotiations of his professional life. She had once told him, in the matter-of-fact way she said most things, that language was not a skill the way most people understood skills. It was closer to a form of hearing. You either heard the way a word was carried or you did not. And no amount of study could give you the hearing if you were not born with it. He had understood, listening to her, that she was describing herself. He had also understood, without her saying it, that she was describing what made her irreplaceable. Then came the winter evening, a dinner in New Jersey, a document found in a location it should never have reached, an FBI contact name that only 3 people in the organization were supposed to know. Beckett Lore had come to his study that night with papers laid out in a sequence on the desk. His voice had carried the particular gravity of a man who has something terrible to report and has prepared himself to report it cleanly. He had been thorough. He had been measured. He had laid out each piece in turn and let the picture assemble itself, which was more persuasive than any argument could have been. She sold us Rowan. She has been feeding the Bureau everything. You know what needs to be done. Rowan had looked at the papers until the words stopped meaning anything. He had told himself he owed it to the organization, to everyone whose lives depended on the structure holding, not to let personal feeling complicate a necessary conclusion. He had given the nod, the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when he cannot trust his own voice. Beckett had handled it personally. 2 days later, snow still on his shoulders, he had come back and delivered his report in the tone of a man completing a routine task. It is done. She had no family, nothing to clean up after. Now Rowan sat in a locked library with that photograph trembling between his fingers and the knowledge that the child upstairs had been hidden in the closet behind her mother's dresses when those words were spoken for the first time. August said, "What are you thinking?" Rowan said, "I am thinking about what Beckett told me that night, what he showed me, how complete it was." August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I started pulling threads this evening while you were with the girl. I had someone I trust look at 3 accounts." He opened the leather folder on his knee. He said the first account is small, deposits over 20 months, consistent, arriving in the same week of every month. I cross-referenced the routing codes against a Department of Justice filing from 2 years back. Same pattern. Bureau work. Informant payments laundered through a cutout in Baltimore. Beckett has been receiving money from the FBI for 18 months. Rowan said nothing. August said the second account connects to Casper directly. 6 transfers over 14 months. The last one arrived 11 days ago, $200,000, a down payment on something not yet completed. He paused. He said, "The third one is what turned my stomach. He has been pulling from our own books. The construction union, the Jersey waste haulers, the peer rotation. Small amounts, always below audit threshold. Over 2 years, it adds up to just under $4 million. He closed the folder. He said, "Rowan, I need to say something to you now, not as your advisor, but as August." Rowan waited. August said, "You made that call a year ago based on information Beckett brought you. That does not erase what you decided. You know that. I know that. But it means you were moved by a hand that was working against you. You were not moving freely." Rowan turned his face toward the dark fireplace. He said, "I gave the nod, August. No one else moves my head. August was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, that is true." The silence between them was the particular silence of two people who have been honest with each other for a long time and know when honesty has said everything it has to say. Then the burner phone on the table beside Rowan vibrated once, a text from a number that existed only for this purpose. 4 words, eyes on the house. Rowan was standing before the message finished arriving. He crossed the hallway and took the stairs at speed, moving through the dark of the upper floor without turning on any light, and pushed open the guest room door. The lamp on the nightstand was still on. Wren was on top of the covers, with her shoes off and the bear tucked under her chin, and her face had the particular unguarded softness of a child who has finally allowed herself to sleep somewhere she does not have to calculate the risk of sleeping. He crossed the room in 3 strides and placed his hand on her shoulder with the deliberate firmness of a person who needs to be heard immediately but will not frighten. "Wren, open your eyes. We have to go right now." She surfaced from sleep slowly. Her lashes moved. Then her eyes opened and found his face, and something in the exact register of his voice cut through the last layer of sleep more completely than any urgency could have managed. She sat up. She pulled the oversized coat around her shoulders without being asked to do it twice, and swung her feet to the floor and looked at him with an alertness that no child her age should have had to develop. Rowan said, "If I stop, you stop. If I run, you run. No sounds." She nodded once. They had reached the top of the service stairs when the first flashlight beam cut across the library window on the ground floor below them. White, disciplined, the systematic sweep of people who had done this before. Then a second beam, a third fanning out across the street-facing curtains. Rowan did not wait to confirm what he already knew. He lifted Wren into the crook of his left arm, pressed her face gently against his shoulder, and took the narrow stairs 2 at a time, moving down through the dark of the house with the practiced silence of a person who learned long ago how to carry weight quickly and quietly. Vera Tully was at the bottom of the basement stairs in her housecoat, with keys already in her hand. She had worked for Rowan Gale for 11 years. She did not ask questions. She said the tunnel runs to the service alley behind the dry cleaner on 72nd. August is already there. She stepped aside and pressed the keys into Rowan's free hand. He touched the top of her gray hair briefly as he passed and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate, and he knew it. Then they were in the tunnel, cold and damp and smelling of old brick and underground water. Wren's arms tightened around his neck. The bear pressed between them. Muffled through the concrete and the distance above came the first shout. Then boots on hardwood, a door coming in hard. One room being searched, then another arriving at an empty bed 1 minute too late. The alley door opened on well-oiled hinges, and the night received them. Wet pavement, steam rising from the grates, the orange bleed of sodium light across old brick. August held the rear door of a dark sedan open with the expression of a man who has been running from one impossible situation to the next for 40 years and has simply made his peace with the pace. They moved. 2 blocks behind them, the first tactical vehicle arrived at the wrong address. In the warm dark of the back seat, Wren began to cry, not loudly, a small, exhausted, steady crying that came from somewhere very far down, the kind that announces that everything has been held together by force for longer than the force was ever built to last. Her face found his lapel and stayed there. She said, "Why are they chasing me? What did I do wrong?" Rowan looked down at the top of her head, at the color of her hair in the passing light of the city outside the window. He thought about what was true and what was speakable, and where those two things overlapped. He said, "Because you are remarkable, Wren, and the world has a habit of not leaving remarkable things alone." She cried for a little while longer, and then the crying slowed, and then her breathing stretched into the long, even rhythm of a child who has decided for the first time in a very long time to let someone else be responsible for the next hour. Rowan sat completely still so that he would not wake her. They drove east, away from every address Beckett Lore had ever signed off on, toward a walk-up in Astoria that only August Fenn had ever set foot inside, where a woman named Rosa Tully, who was Vera's younger sister and who had been keeping a quiet room available for the past 2 years at August's specific and unexplained request, was already awake and had the kettle on. Morning came sideways through gauze curtains the color of old cream, falling across the narrow couch where Wren lay curled beneath a plaid blanket, with one hand tucked under her cheek and the other locked around the bear's middle. She breathed the long, unhurried breathing of someone who had not slept this deeply in a very long time. Rowan had not slept at all. He had spent the hours between 4 and 7 in the gap beside the window curtain with a cup of coffee. August had pressed into his hand, somewhere around 5, that had been cold for 2 hours by the time he noticed. He watched the street below with the sustained attention of a man who is not looking for anything specific, because he understands that specific threats announce themselves, and the ones that kill you are the ones you never identified. When the first shaft of morning light found Wren's cheek and turned it gold, he rose quietly and went to the kitchen. He stood in front of the open refrigerator for a moment that was longer than strictly necessary. Eggs, butter, a loaf of bread that had seen better days. He had not cooked anything for another person in more years than he could accurately remember, and the inside of a stranger's kitchen presented itself to him as a problem he had not been briefed on. He cracked 4 eggs into a pan that was already too hot because he had forgotten to adjust the burner after the coffee and the butter hissed and went immediately dark around the edges. He tried to manage the situation with a fork. The fork scraped the surface in a way that confirmed several of his recent decisions had been wrong. He burned his knuckle, reaching for a towel. The bread went into the toaster and came out shortly afterward, the color of a decision that should have been made differently. A voice behind him said in careful accented English, with something in it that was almost amusement, "You cook very badly." He turned, Wren stood in the kitchen doorway in a t-shirt August had found for her that reached her knees. Her hair was a complete catastrophe. Her feet were bare on the linoleum, and her eyes, which had held nothing but watchfulness or calculated calm since the moment he had first seen her, were holding something different now. Not quite laughter, something in the same neighborhood as laughter observing the neighborhood from a careful distance. The corner of Rowan's mouth did something without his full authorization. Then, without anything he could describe as a deliberate choice, a sound came out of his chest. Short, rusty, surprised. A laugh. An actual laugh. The kind he had apparently stopped producing long enough ago that it startled him more than it startled her. He said, "The eggs are a disaster. I will freely admit that." She climbed into the chair at the small table by the window. Her feet did not reach the floor. She considered the plate he set in front of her with the gravity of a small judge evaluating a piece of evidence, and then began to work methodically around the least burned portions with the patience of a child who has known actual hunger and has learned not to waste food even when the food is a significant disappointment. After a while, without looking up, she said, "My mother made scrambled eggs with a little milk and salt added at the end. Not at the beginning. He said your mother was smarter than me about eggs. She said she was smarter than you about most things." He sat across from her and let that land where it landed. After a moment, he said, "Tell me about her. Tell me what you remember." Wren set her fork down on the rim of the plate. She looked at the window. Outside, Astoria was beginning its morning in the unhurried way of neighborhoods that have been themselves for a long time and see no reason to change. She said she had hair like mine, but longer. She kept it up most of the time when she was working because she said it was more professional. But at home she wore it down, and she let me braid it, even though I was not very good at braiding. She said she smelled like the soap from the yellow bottle. She always bought the yellow bottle, even when the other one was cheaper. She said she sang when she cooked. Not songs with words, just sounds. She said it was something her mother used to do. Rowan listened. He did not speak. He understood that Wren was giving him these things on her own terms and at her own pace, and that the right response was to receive them without interruption. She said she worked very hard. I knew she was tired sometimes, but she did not say so. She just got quieter. I learned to make her tea when she got quieter, because she forgot to make it herself. She picked up her fork again. She moved a piece of egg to the side of the plate. She said she told me once that there would be times when knowing another language would feel like a secret door that only I could see. She said the trick was not to let the people on the other side of the door know you could see it. Rowan said she was right about that. Wren said, "I know, I used it last night." She said it simply, not with pride, the way a person states a fact about a tool that performed as expected. He looked at her across the small table with the badly cooked eggs and the two dark toast and the morning light coming through the gauze curtains, and he thought about the call he had made a year ago and what it had cost and what it had left behind. He said, "Wren, there is something I need to tell you. Not this morning, not in the middle of breakfast in a kitchen we are both strangers in, but soon. before anything else happens. There is something you have a right to know." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I already know some of it." He said, "What do you know?" She said, "I know my mother did not die in a car accident. I know the two men who came to our apartment that night worked for someone in this building. I have been listening through your ventilation for 3 months. I heard a great many things." Rowan was quiet. She said, "I do not know everything, but I know enough to know that what you have to tell me is going to be very hard." He said, "Yes, it is." She said, "Then tell me when you are ready. I have been carrying hard things for a year. I can carry them a little longer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You are the most remarkable child I have ever encountered." She considered this seriously. Then she said, "My mother would say, that is because she taught me well." He said she would be right. His phone vibrated on the counter. He rose and stepped into the hallway. August's voice came through, stripped of its usual cadence, flat and deliberate. August said, "I had someone dig further into the night Celeste died. The official report says a single vehicle accident on a rural road outside Albany. Ice on the bridge surface. She went through the guardrail. The investigation was closed in 4 days, which is fast for that county. I had someone pull the original report. There is a notation in the file about paint transfer on the rear quarter panel. Another vehicle made contact before she went through the rail." Rowan stood with his back against the hallway wall and said nothing. August said the notation was not followed up. The investigator who filed the original report was reassigned to a different county 3 weeks after the accident. He now works in a town in western Pennsylvania and does not return calls from journalists or lawyers. I have a number for him, but I will not call it until you tell me to." Rowan said, "Keep digging on Beckett." August said, "Already doing it. There is more. I will have it for you by tonight." Rowan put the phone away. He returned to the kitchen and sat back down across from Wren and picked up his coffee and held it without drinking it. She was watching him. She said, "Is it bad?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Is it about my mother?" He said, "Yes." She nodded. She looked back at the window. A pigeon landed on the sill outside and examined the glass with the brief, focused attention of a creature that has no particular stake in what it finds. Then it left. She said, "I want to know the truth, all of it, even the parts that are your fault." The sentence landed with a precision that the most careful words could not have improved upon. Rowan looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the window, where the pigeon had been. Her hands were folded on the table. Her face was the face of a child who has decided to be ready for something and is doing the interior work of getting there. He said, "You will know all of it. I promise you that." She said, "Good. Then when you are ready, I will be ready." They sat together for a moment in the morning quiet of the small kitchen above the street in Astoria. Two people with a great deal of unspoken territory between them, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a negotiation that has not yet begun, but has already established its terms. Then Rosa Tully knocked on the kitchen door and said she had found a pair of shoes in the storage room that might fit, and a cardigan that was small enough for a child, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do, one ordinary thing at a time, even when what surrounds the ordinary things is anything but. That afternoon, while Wren slept again on the narrow couch and August worked at the kitchen table with 3 phones and a laptop and the focused silence of a man running down something important, Rowan sat in the chair beside the window and thought about what came next. He thought about Beckett Lore. 12 years, 12 years of a face he had trusted at every table, in every room, through every decision that had required a second voice he could rely on. 12 years of a performance so complete that it had grooved itself into the underlying structure of how Rowan understood the people closest to him. He thought about the money, the FBI payments, the Casper payments, the $4 million pulled quietly from the organization's own accounts over 2 years below the audit threshold, steady as a tide. He thought about Celeste Hale, who had figured it out, who had seen the pattern because she was the kind of person who heard what was carried in a word, and not just the word itself, who had probably understood what Beckett was doing before she could prove it, who had then done the thing that had cost her everything, which was to confront him directly rather than go around him, because she had been working for Rowan, and she had trusted that the organization she worked for had a structure that could hold a truth like that. She had been wrong, not about the truth, about the structure. He had been part of why she was wrong. When Wren woke from her afternoon sleep, she came to the chair beside his with the bear and sat with her feet tucked under her and looked at the street below for a while without speaking. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" He said yes. She said, "The man who laughed outside the elevator last night, the one who confirmed the plan with the Russians, is he the same man who came to our apartment with the other man in the black coat?" Rowan looked at her. She said, "I never saw his face. I was in the closet, but I have been listening to voices in your building for 3 months. And the man who laughed outside the elevator last night has a very specific way of breathing when he is satisfied with something. I noticed it because my mother used to say that people reveal themselves in the sounds they make when they think no one is listening." She looked at him with her pale blue eyes that held the particular quality of someone who already knows the answer to the question they are asking and is offering the other person the dignity of confirmation rather than discovery. He said yes. I believe it was the same man. She absorbed this. She did not react to it in any way he had language for. She simply sat with it the way she had sat with other hard things directly, without trying to move it to a more comfortable position. She said then, "He is the reason you gave the order." He said yes. She said, "And my mother found out what he was doing." He said yes. She said, "And he used you to stop her from telling anyone." Rowan said yes. The word came out with difficulty that he did not try to conceal. Wren looked at the street below. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Then I need you to tell me everything now. Not later. Now. Before tonight. Before whatever you are planning next." He said, "There is a place. An abandoned church on Staten Island. August knows it. It is outside every pattern Beckett has access to. We will go there tonight," she said, and you will tell me everything there." He said everything, "I promise." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and tucked the bear more firmly under her arm and turned back to the window and watched the street below, the way she had learned to watch everything completely without performing, the watching, simply taking in what was there and filing it away in the part of her mind that her mother had built and that no one had been able to reach since. Rosa Tully made soup for dinner. Nobody talked much. August came to the table with the careful, controlled face of a man who has found things he wishes he had not found and is managing the finding. Rowan met his eyes across the table. August gave a single, small nod that meant, "Tonight, when we are alone, there is more." Rowan gave a single, small nod back that meant, "I know. I expected it." They ate the soup. Wren finished hers and asked politely if there was more. Rosa brought more. The small, ordinary gesture of the question and the answer sat in the room like a stone in water, sending out rings that none of them commented on. After dinner, they moved. The drive across the Verrazano Bridge was quiet. The water below it was black and moving. The lights of Brooklyn behind them. Staten Island, receiving them into its particular, dark residential and quiet, and smelling of old neighborhoods that had been there before the city finished deciding what it was, and had simply stayed when the deciding was done. The church sat on a rise at the end of a narrow lane. It had been abandoned for 30 years, and wore its abandonment the way certain old things do not, as a wound, but as a condition. Its bell tower had partially collapsed. Its stained glass was boarded over from the outside. Its front door was unlocked because there was nothing inside worth locking away, and because Rowan had arranged for it to remain unlocked 2 years ago when he had first made note of it as the kind of place that might one day be needed for exactly this kind of night. He carried Wren up the front steps because the stone was uneven and the dark was complete, and because she was 7 years old and had been carrying things for long enough that he could carry her for 20 feet, without it meaning more than it meant. Inside, the pews were still arranged for a congregation that was not coming back. The air smelled of dust and cold stone and the particular loneliness of places built for a purpose that outlasted the people who arrived to fulfill it. Rowan set Wren down on the front pew, the one nearest the altar. He knelt on the cold stone floor in front of her until their eyes were level in the dark. He said her name first, the way you say a name when you know that what follows it is going to change something permanently. He said, "Wren, I need to tell you something. It is going to be the hardest thing you have ever heard, and I am not going to protect you from any part of it. Not because I do not want to, but because you have a right to the full truth, and I will not insult you by giving you anything less." She wrapped both hands around the bear. She looked at him steadily. She said, "I am ready." And Rowan Gale, who had built an empire on silence and on the careful management of what was said and what was left unsaid, opened his mouth in the cold dark of an abandoned church in Staten Island, and let the truth come out, piece by piece, everything he had been carrying since the night a year ago when he had given the smallest nod in the world and changed the life of the child sitting in front of him forever. He told her about Celeste, not the version that left out the parts that cast the longest shadow, the full version, the one that included a woman who had corrected his grandfather's Russian dialect without making him feel corrected, who had stayed awake for 30 hours in a hotel room to keep a man alive with nothing but her voice and her fluency and her refusal to let the conversation end. He told her about the winter evening, the papers on the desk, the sequence designed to tell a story, the man who had laid it out with the careful gravity of a trusted advisor delivering terrible news. He told her about the nod. He told her that Beckett Lore had been selling information to the FBI for 18 months before Celeste died. He told her that Celeste had found out and that Beckett had used Rowan's trust in him to do the thing that would protect himself. He told her that her mother had been innocent of everything she had been accused of. He told her that he had given an order based on a lie, and that the order had reached all the way down to a closet behind 17 dresses where a 6-year-old girl had been counting the dresses in the dark and holding a bear with a ribbon around its neck and staying very quiet because that was what her mother had told her to do. When he finished, the silence was so complete that he could hear a pigeon on the boarded roof above them, its feet finding the seams between the planks with small, deliberate sounds. Then the first tear ran down Wren Hale's cheek, and then the second. She said in a voice very small and very certain, "You killed my mother." Rowan did not look away. He did not reach for her hand. He sat on the cold stone and held the weight of what she had said against his chest, and did not try to move it to any position that was easier to hold. He said, "I gave the order. I was lied to, yes. But the nod was mine. The mouth was mine. The fact that the man who directed my hand was acting from his own evil does not wash the hand clean. If you want to hate me, Wren, you have every right to it. You can tell me to walk out that door and never look at you again, and I will do it, because I owe you that choice. That is the one thing I can give you that I have not already taken away." The silence that followed was the longest he had ever sat inside. Wren did not move for a long time. She stared at the bear in her lap. Her small shoulders shook once, twice, without producing sound. More tears came, and still she made no noise, because she had learned somewhere in the past year in some hour that had no business being part of a childhood that grief does not require an audience to be real, and that the spending of it is a private transaction between a person and the thing they have lost. Rowan waited on the stone floor. He did not speak. He did not move. He owed her this waiting, and he knew it, and he gave it fully. Then Wren lifted her face. She did not look at him. She looked up past the stripped altar, past the bare rafters, where the last light coming through the gaps in the boarded roof turned the highest beams the color of old honey. She looked at the vaulted ceiling for a long time with the expression of someone listening to something not audible to anyone else in the room. When she looked back at him, her eyes were wet, but her voice was the voice of a person who has arrived somewhere. She said my mother told me something. She said you have to learn the difference between a bad person and a person who did a bad thing. She said bad people do not feel the weight of what they have done. They do not kneel. They do not say, you have the right to hate me. They find a way to make it someone else's fault, and they walk away with their hands clean. She said the person who did a bad thing and knows it, who sits still under it and does not try to move it around to be more comfortable, that person still has a chance to become something different. Her voice did not waver. She said, you did a bad thing, Uncle Rowan, the worst thing anyone has ever done to me. But you are kneeling on the floor of this cold church and telling me the truth when you could have told me a version of it that I would have had no way to check. That means something. My mother said it means something. She reached out. One small hand still trembling. She placed it on his wrist. She said, I forgive you. Rowan Gale lowered his face into the palm of that small hand and wept. Not in the careful, controlled way that men of his kind permit themselves, not briefly, not quietly, but in the way that something breaks when it has been holding against pressure for longer than it was built to hold, and the pressure is finally more than the structure can answer. August Fenn stood in the doorway of the sacristy and watched this and turned his face away. Not because he did not want to see it, because he had lived 66 years and he understood instinctively that what he was watching belonged entirely to the people inside it. He stood there for a long time before he moved. Night settled into the abandoned church, and August brought candles from the trunk of the second car. Thick white emergency candles meant for power outages, and placed them along the edge of the altar. Luca brought blankets from the same source. August produced a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of rolls from a diner 12 blocks away that asked no questions and received no explanations. Wren slept on the front pew, wrapped in a wool blanket, with the bear tucked under her chin. Her breathing was long and even and undisturbed in a way it had not been in days. In the sacristy at the back of the church, Rowan spread a map of Brooklyn across a dusty wooden table. 4 men arranged around it in the flickering light, their shadows tall against the old stone walls. August said, I have the rest of what I found. He set 3 printed pages on the map. Beckett has a meeting scheduled for tomorrow evening in Brighton Beach. A tea room he has used before. I know the location. I have a man who can place a device inside his coat before the meeting. Beckett will not know it is there. Rowan said Casper will be there. August said almost certainly. Beckett will need to explain why the Red Hook arrangement failed. He will need to offer something. The most valuable thing he can offer right now is the girl. The room was quiet. Lucas said, so we let the meeting happen. Rowan said, we let the meeting happen. We hear every word, and then we use what we hear. He placed his finger on the map at Pier 16 in Red Hook. He said Beckett believes he still has a path to what Casper promised him. $5 million and Casper's protection. He will not abandon that path because it is the only one he has left. So we give him the meeting. We give him the sense that he is still in control of what comes next. And then we invite him to Red Hook one more time. Polly from the Bronx said, and Casper Rowan said we send word to Casper tonight. Gail wants to make the arrangement right. The money has doubled. Come to Red Hook at 11 with his principals. His ego will not permit him to decline. August said, and Beckett comes as your second. Rowan said Beckett comes as my second. He believes he is walking me into a final collection. He will be more relaxed than he has ever been in his life. And Wren stands between us. He paused. He said she translates exactly what she hears. Every word Casper says, every word Beckett confirms, and this time there is no adjustment. This time it goes out exactly as spoken through a device that streams live to Agent Claire Moss at the Bureau's Manhattan field office. Moss has been building a case against me for 2 years. Tonight she receives the case against the man she has been paying for 18 months. The room was quiet for a moment. Polly said Rowan. He said it carefully, the way men speak when they are about to say the thing no one else has said yet. If we put that child on that pier with Casper's people and something goes wrong before we can close it, she is 7 years old. No one looked at Rowan directly. No one moved. Rowan did not answer immediately. He sat with the question the way a person sits with something they owe full attention to. And the fact that he sat with it, rather than dismissing it, told August something he would think about for a long time afterward. He said, "Nobody moves until I ask her. This plan cannot be done to a child. It has to be done with her." August said, "Understood." Rowan rose from the table and walked back into the nave. Wren was still asleep. He sat on the edge of the pew beside her and placed one hand lightly on the blanket over her ribs and waited. After a moment, she stirred. Her pale eyes opened and found his face in the candlelight with the directness of someone who has been waking up in uncertain places long enough to be immediately present. He explained the plan, all of it. He used plain words. He told her what he needed and what it would mean if it worked and what it would mean if it did not. He left nothing softened and nothing out. Wren listened without looking away from his face. When he finished, she held the bear against her mouth and breathed twice, slow and deliberate. She said, "I am very scared. I want you to know that. I am very, very scared." He said, "I know." She said, "But I will do it. For my mother. So the man who did that to her cannot do it to anyone else's mother ever again." Rowan's throat closed. He had to wait before he could speak. He said, "Wren Hale, you are the bravest person I have ever known, not the bravest child, the bravest person." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. The gesture was the gesture of complete, uncomplicated trust, and it undid him more thoroughly than anything else that had happened in this long and difficult night. She said, "Then let us finish it." The following evening, in a windowless back booth of a Russian tea room on Brighton Beach, Beckett Lore sat across from Dmitri Casper with the posture of a man who has staked everything on a single remaining card and is waiting to see how the table falls. Casper had a glass of tea gone cold and the expression of a man who has been publicly inconvenienced and is deciding how much it will cost the person responsible. Casper said 5 in the morning at the Brooklyn docks, I stood in the cold for 2 hours with 12 men. Nobody came. You told me Gale would walk in like a lamb. Beckett said it was the girl. She altered the translation. I did not see it coming. Casper's pale eyes did not shift. He said, "A child outplayed you." Beckett said, "I know how to fix it. Give me until tomorrow night. I know where they are." Casper leaned forward. His voice dropped to the register that carried a specific weight in it, the weight of a decision already made that only requires execution. He said the child is a problem that needs to be removed. For Gale's head, I will pay you $5 million in clean American currency, wired anywhere in the world you choose. Beckett Lore did not hesitate. He said, "Give me until tomorrow night." What Beckett Lore did not know was that 3 miles north, in the back office of a garage in Queens that smelled of motor oil and cold concrete, Rowan Gale was listening to every word of that conversation in real time through a device no larger than a button sewn into the lining of Beckett's own coat behind the left breast pocket, installed the previous afternoon by a man who had been given 1 hour and used 40 minutes of it. Rowan's face was stone when the recording ended. He reached forward and closed the laptop. He said, "Prepare everything. Tomorrow night, 11 o'clock. The warehouse at Pier 16 in Red Hook had been abandoned for 40 years and wore its abandonment with the comfort of a thing that has long since made peace with what it is. Its corrugated roof sagged in 3 places. Its concrete floor was a layered record of decades of industry salt and rust and the cold off the harbor that found every gap in the corrugated walls and moved through the space like something with its own purpose. A single bank of industrial lights hung from the high rafters and threw long, hard shadows across the shipping containers arranged in rows down the center of the space. 11 at night. The air off the water was cold enough to make breathing visible. Rowan Gale stood at the center of the warehouse in his charcoal overcoat, with his hands open at his sides. To his left, Beckett Lore in his navy suit, the face of trusted loyalty, worn so long it had settled into the bone beneath. Between them, barely reaching Rowan's hip, Wren Hale. She was wearing a new coat. Cream wool clean lines bought that afternoon from a children's store in Bay Ridge. Her hair was pinned back with 2 tortoiseshell clips. Her sneakers had been replaced with clean brown leather shoes, 1 size too large. Her hands were at her sides. The recording device was pinned inside the lining of her coat, directly behind the rebang ribbon on the bear, directly over her heart. Rowan had checked it twice before they left the car. The freight door at the far end of the warehouse rolled upward on its mechanism with a long metallic groan. Dmitri Casper walked in at the head of 8 men. Rowan counted them without appearing to count. 8 professionals, 4 spreading left, 4 right, each coat tailored to conceal what it needed to conceal. Casper himself wore black with a fur collar, and his pale eyes found Wren immediately. He spread his hands with the expansive pleasure of a man who finds something unexpectedly entertaining. He spoke in Russian, his voice carrying easily across the concrete floor. Wren did not react. She turned her face up to Rowan and said, in bright, polite English, "Mr. Casper says the child is a pleasant surprise." He did not expect her to be here. Every drop of blood in Beckett Lore's body stopped moving. Rowan smiled without warmth and kept his eyes on Casper. He said, "Translate my reply. Tell Mr. Casper that good help is where you find it, and let us discuss the new terms like professionals." Wren turned and delivered the sentence in Russian. Casper chuckled and opened his portfolio, and for 4 minutes the negotiation ran as expected. Wren moved cleanly between the two languages, her voice steady, her hands still. She rendered every number and condition exactly as spoken and reversed the current for Rowan's replies with the same seamless accuracy. Beckett began to relax by increments. His shoulders dropped a fraction. The drumming of his fingers against his thigh beneath the line of his jacket slowed and then stopped. Then Casper tilted his head slightly toward his men. His voice dropped into the casual murmur of someone confirming an arrangement already agreed upon. He spoke in Russian, and he did not bother to slow it down because he had no reason to believe there was anyone in this room who could catch it at full speed. He said, "The moment the money is in my hand, shoot Gale where he stands. Take the child alive. That is our arrangement." Beckett's chin moved once, the smallest possible confirmation from the closest possible distance. Rowan's heart beat exactly one slow time. He turned his head slightly toward Wren and said in the mild tone of a man requesting a description of the specials, "Darling, translate that for the room, please. Loud enough for everyone to hear." Wren took one small breath. She straightened her spine by a fraction. The movement of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment and recognizes that the moment has arrived. Her voice, when it came, was perfectly clear and carried to every rafter and every corner of the warehouse, and to the earpiece in the surveillance van parked 2 blocks east, where Agent Claire Moss sat with her laptop open and a recording already running. She said, "Mr. Casper has just given the order for Mr. Beckett Lore to shoot Mr. Rowan Gale immediately after receiving the money and to take me alive." Those are his exact words in Russian. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the building seemed to hold itself. Then Beckett Lore's voice cracked down the center. He said, "She is lying. She is a child, Rowan. She is making it up. She does not understand what she heard." Rowan's voice came out quiet and entirely level. The voice of a man who has already done the arithmetic and arrived at the only answer the numbers permit. He said, "Is she Beckett? Is she making it up? Then explain to me how a 7-year-old child who has never been inside this organization learned the phrase 'the crow flies at 3. Explain the red lamp. Explain the chessboard. You and I and August and 2 other men in the world know those codes. Tell me how a child picked them out of the air." Beckett's jaw moved without producing sound. The calculation, running behind his eyes, arrived at its conclusion, and his hand moved toward his jacket. Rowan's hand moved at the same moment. Beckett was fast. Rowan was faster by the margin of a single heartbeat. The difference between a man who has been doing this for 20 years and a man who has been performing it for 12. The round caught Beckett through the right shoulder and spun him back against the near wall. His own shot went wide and punched a hole through a steel crossbeam 15 feet above the floor, sending a brief curtain of orange sparks raining down across the concrete. The warehouse went to war. August Fenn and 10 men came up from behind 4 shipping containers simultaneously. The old maneuver, the closing mouth last run 9 years ago. Sal from the left with his shotgun, Luca from the right, Paulie and his cousins from the catwalk above. Casper's 8 men reacted the way professionals react, which was faster than most people, and not fast enough for what was already in motion around them. 2 went down before their hands cleared their holsters. A third managed 1 shot at August's position before Luca's burst caught him in the chest. Casper himself turned toward his own weapon, and Sal's shotgun took him through the left shoulder at 40 feet, spinning the large man down to one knee against a rusted oil drum. Wren screamed once. Rowan was already moving not toward the fight, but toward her, and the 2 of them went down together, behind a rusted steel container with faded lettering. His body went over hers. His coat absorbed 2 rounds in rapid succession against the ceramic plate, beneath the fabric, the second impact cracking it. He felt it through his ribs like a fist. Wren went completely still beneath him. She pressed her face into the wool of his lapel and did not cry, and did not speak, and did not do anything except wait with the absolute stillness of someone who has learned that sometimes waiting is the only available action and has made her peace with that. He said against her hair, "Stay down, stay down." Across the floor, Beckett was crawling. His right shoulder had soaked through the navy jacket, but he was still moving, pulling himself toward the cover of a concrete support column, with his good hand and with his teeth. He had the phone from his breast pocket, and he was shouting into it with a desperation that had stripped away every layer of the performance he had maintained for 12 years. The address came out. FBI Tactical. Every unit on the waterfront. Come now. Rowan heard it. He said against Wren's ear, "Wren, stay behind this container. Do not move until I come back for you, no matter what you hear." He started to rise. Wren's hand caught his sleeve, not to stop him, just briefly, the lightest possible contact. He looked down. She said, "Be careful." He said, "I will." He cleared the edge of the container in a crouch and moved across the open floor. Beckett had pulled himself upright against the column, his face a construction of pain and fury in which the performance had finally given way entirely to the thing it had always been concealing. His good hand was coming up with the pistol he had transferred from belt to palm during the crawl. He did not see Rowan yet. He was looking at the container, at what was behind the container. His voice came out raw. He said, You did this to me. You little." Wren raised her face above the edge of the container. Her pale blue eyes were calm in the flickering industrial light, with a calmness that no child's eyes should ever be required to carry. But she had been building toward this moment in one form or another since the night she had spent in a closet behind her mother's dresses, and she was ready for it. She looked past Beckett's shoulder. She found the industrial gas line running along the base of the far wall, the pipe painted with faded yellow warning stripes from its working years, disconnected for 2 decades and entirely harmless, but painted with a color that the body reads before the mind does painted, with the universal language of danger that crosses every border and every tongue. She looked back at Beckett Lore, and she spoke in German, soft and clear, the language her mother had taught her. Second, the language her mother's father had spoken in Dresden, the language Beckett Lore had sat through a dozen dinners unable to follow while Celeste Hale quietly tested him across the table. She said, careful, behind you is the gas pipe. 2 seconds. The word gas travels across languages by sound and by reflex. Beckett's head turned. Half a second of pure animal self-preservation overriding everything else. Half a second was the distance between where they were and somewhere entirely different. Rowan rose from behind the container with his pistol already level and put a round into the outside of Beckett's right thigh. Beckett screamed and went down hard, the gun flying from his hand and spinning across the concrete into the dark beneath a container 20 feet away. He lay on the stained floor with both sleeves of his jacket gone dark red, conscious, breathing in long, furious pulls, the look of a man who has lost the thing he considered certain and has not yet arrived at any form of acceptance. The shooting around them was slowing. Casper's last 2 standing men had their hands flat against the rear wall, with Luca and Sal keeping them there. Casper himself was slumped against the oil drum, gray-faced, breathing in the angry, careful way of a man managing serious pain and refusing to let it show. Rowan crossed the floor. He kicked Beckett's weapon further into the dark and stood looking down at the man who had sat to his left for 12 years and worn loyalty the way a coat is worn, something to be removed when the weather changed. He did not shoot him again. Wren came out from behind the container. She did not run. She walked, her chin lifted, and she crossed the floor and stood beside Rowan and looked down at Beckett Lore for a long moment without saying anything at all. Then she took Rowan's free hand in her own small one. Far away across the harbor growing came the sound of sirens, not 1 or 2, many. The converging sound of the full weight of the federal government arriving at a location pointed to by a man who had spent the last 90 seconds burning every bridge he had ever built. Rowan knew that sound. He had studied the tactical manuals, not because he intended to cooperate with them, but because a man in his position found it useful to understand the timelines of the people who hunted him. 2 minutes before the perimeter closed and every exit became a wall, he dropped to one knee on the concrete. He took Wren's shoulders in both hands and turned her so that his face was what she was looking at, not the man on the floor behind him. He said, "Wren, look at me." She did. Her eyes had filled in the way that eyes fill when a child understands that something is ending and cannot be unended, and the understanding is arriving faster than the acceptance. He said, I am not going to run tonight. You are. You go with August out the service door. There is a car in the alley. August drives you to Tatum Brierly's bakery in Little Italy. She is expecting you. She has been expecting you since this afternoon. She said no. Come with us. He said this is the only way any of this ends without you being hurt worse than you have already been. He reached into his inside pocket and pressed a small drive into her palm and closed her fingers around it. He said this is everything. Every account Beckett used, every transfer between him and the Bureau, every conversation between him and Casper, everything I have ever signed in this organization, all of it in one small thing. You give it to Agent Moss, but only when she is alone, and only when she gives you her word out loud that you go free tonight and receive federal protection. August will tell you when the moment is right. She said, but you are good now. You are good now. You cannot go to prison for things you did before you were good. He put one hand on each side of her face. His palms were large and rough and covered the sides of her head almost completely. He said, sweetheart, I have done many things in my life that cannot be fixed with one good night in a warehouse. I have been running from those things for 15 years. Tonight, I am going to stop running and let them catch me, because a man who does not pay for what he has done has not really changed. He has only waited. Do you understand the difference? She said no. He said, I know. One day you will. And when you do, I want you to remember that choosing to pay was the first clean thing I ever did, and I only became capable of it because of you. August appeared at his shoulder. His weathered face was openly wet, and he was making no effort to be otherwise. Rowan kept his eyes on Wren. He said, you are going to have a life, a real one. You are going to go to school. You are going to grow into a woman your mother would be proud of. You are going to learn every language you can get your hands on. For your mother, who started you on the road, and for me. Because every word you learn will be a light you are lighting for someone I will not be there to light one for. He pressed his lips against her forehead, the gentlest thing he had ever done. He said, go, sweetheart, run. The sirens were close now, rubber against wet asphalt, the low mechanical sound of tactical vehicles. August gathered Wren and she struggled. She reached back over his shoulder toward Rowan with both arms, her fingers opening and closing in the air, reaching for something across a distance that was widening faster than she expected. She said, Uncle Rowan, Uncle Rowan. Her voice broke on the second syllable of the second time. Then she went still against August's coat, the way a child goes still when she understands that the world has decided something and her wanting will not change it. August carried her out through the service door. Rowan stood alone in the center of the warehouse. He unbuckled the shoulder holster and let it fall to the concrete. The sound it made was the sound of something finished. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the white handkerchief and held it between two fingers. He raised both hands above his head. The freight door erupted. Tactical lights hit him from 3 directions at once. Voices, laser sights tracking across his chest. Men in black gear with FBI stenciled in yellow. flooding the warehouse from every entrance, boots on concrete rifles, up the organized force of a system that had been built for exactly this kind of moment. Rowan Gale walked forward to meet them. His chin was up, his hands were steady. The handkerchief moved slowly in the cold air above his head. And somewhere between the third and fourth step, something settled inside him that had not been settled in a very long time. Not peace. Something quieter than peace and less resolved. Something closer to the sensation of having finally stopped moving away from a thing that had been waiting and turned around and let it find you where you stood. He walked out into the lights. 6 months later, the United States Federal Courthouse at Foley Square was packed beyond every recorded capacity. Reporters had been in line since before sunrise. The story of the United States versus Rowan Gale had been the story of the spring, and the courtroom sketches on the evening news had failed to capture the strange, specific gravity of what was unfolding inside those walls. Rowan sat at the defense table in a simple dark suit with no tie. His hair had grown slightly past what it had been, and a thread of silver had appeared at his left temple. He sat straight. He did not look at the gallery. The charges, read over 2 full hours, did not include murder. The evidence on the drive that Wren Hale had pressed into Agent Claire Moss's gloved hand on a freezing November morning had been too complete to allow any other reading. Beckett Lohr's voice, time-stamped and cross-referenced across 18 months of intercepted calls, had described in his own words the events on a road outside Albany. He had described the weather. He had described the final words Celeste Hale had spoken. He had described returning to Rowan's study with snow still on his coat. Federal prosecutors had concluded that the line of moral responsibility for Celeste's death ran through Beckett Lohr and stopped there. Rowan had given an order based on fabricated evidence extracted from a man who had been handed a lie and asked to respond to it as though it were the truth. Rowan was charged with racketeering money, laundering, extortion, tax fraud, illegal firearms possession, and conspiracy. 27 counts. He pleaded guilty to every single one. Beckett Lohr had been tried separately 4 months earlier, 47 counts, including the murder of Celeste Hale, the murder of Owen Pratt, treason against the Federal Witness Protection Program, and the attempted murder of a minor. 40 years in a maximum security facility in Colorado with no possibility of parole for 32 of them. Dmitry Kasper received life on 3 continents worth of charges. Agent Claire Moss was suspended for 91 days. The Office of Professional Responsibility concluded she had been systematically deceived and at no point knowingly protected a murderer. She was reinstated and reassigned. For the rest of her career, she kept in her desk drawer a small photograph of a 7-year-old girl in a cream coat, handing her a device the size of a thumb drive in the dark before dawn. She never spoke of it to anyone. She did not need to. On the 5th day of Rowan's trial, the prosecution called its youngest witness. Wren Hale, 8 years old, walked to the stand in a simple white dress Tatum Brierly had sewn by hand the night before. Her blonde hair was held back with a navy ribbon. Her shoes were black patent leather and did not quite reach the floor when she climbed into the witness chair. A court-appointed child advocate sat beside her. Judge Margaret Forsyth, gray-haired with 19 years on the federal bench, adjusted her glasses and spoke to Wren with a gentleness she did not often deploy in that courtroom. She said, "Young lady, you may speak in any language you are comfortable in. We have interpreters present. Take all the time you need." Wren nodded once. She began in English. She told the court about the conference room on the 40th floor and the service door that opened from the wrong side, and the man who had asked her to translate, and the negotiation that had run for 6 clean minutes before the instructions in Russian that she had understood completely. She shifted into Russian when she described what Casper had said at the pier. She said quietly to the courtroom that some things should be repeated in the language they were spoken in, so that the record knows exactly what they sounded like. She moved into German when she described the night her mother had not come home. She described the closet. She described the gap in the door. She repeated the sentence she had heard through that gap in German, which was her mother's language, the one Celeste Hale had taught her daughter before any other. The courtroom was entirely still. By the time Wren reached the moment in the abandoned church when Rowan had knelt on the cold stone and told her the truth about her mother, Judge Forsyth had removed her glasses and was pressing a folded handkerchief against the corner of one eye. 3 members of the jury were openly weeping. Rowan Gale at the defense table sat with both hands folded on the wood in front of him and made no attempt to conceal what was running quietly down the sides of his face. When Wren stepped down from the witness stand, she looked across the room and found him. She had always been very good at finding the face she was looking for in a room full of other faces. Rowan placed his right hand against his chest. Wren nodded once. 2 weeks later, after a sentencing hearing in which the lead prosecutor herself asked the court for leniency in recognition of extraordinary cooperation, Judge Forsyth handed down her sentence. 12 years at the Federal Correctional Institution at Allenwood, Pennsylvania, with eligibility for early release after 10 upon continued good behavior and testimony. The gavel fell. Rowan nodded once slowly. He was already looking at the 3rd row of the gallery, where Wren sat between Tatum Brierly and August Fenn. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than the room knew what to do with. Then the marshals were at his elbows, and the moment was over, and the room began its slow official dissolution into noise and motion and the ordinary business of consequence. A week after sentencing in the visitation wing at Allenwood, Wren sat on a plastic chair and pressed her palm against the reinforced glass. Rowan's hand came up from the other side, finger to finger, separated by half an inch of prison plexiglass. She held the old handset against her ear and said, "In 10 years, I will be right here waiting for you, every single day until then. That is not a question, that is a fact." He looked at her through the glass, at the color of her hair, at her mother's cheekbones on a face that was entirely her own. He said, "I know it is." Wren Hale's formal adoption by Tatum and Garrett Brierly was finalized on a bright Tuesday in April, 2 months after Rowan entered federal custody. Garrett, a retired carpenter with hands like catcher's mitts and a laugh that came from somewhere very deep, carried her out of the courthouse on his shoulders with the undisguised pride of a man who had just won the only championship that had ever mattered to him. The child who had been invisible for a year became the most beloved small person in Little Italy. Tatum moved a brass bed into the sunlit room above the bakery. Garrett built a bookshelf that ran the length of one entire wall. By the end of the first summer, Wren had filled 3 of its 5 shelves with library books in 4 languages. August. Fenn walked her to school every morning at 7:30 and collected her every afternoon at 3. The neighborhood called him Grandpa August within a month. He never corrected anyone. The trust that Rowan had created on that last night in a Jersey City office grew quietly in Geneva compound interest, moving patiently forward with Wren's name on every page. Each month on the first Sunday, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote Rowan a long letter. January in Italian, March in German, her mother's language, June in Russian, the first key Celeste had ever handed her, September in English, the language she was growing up in. Rowan wrote back always in the language the letter had arrived in, and always ended with the same 2 words, always yours. In her 15th year, Wren Hale won the National Junior Interpretation Championship in Washington. The finals were broadcast on public television. She translated a simulated United Nations crisis briefing across 3 languages with a precision the judging panel described as something they had not encountered in 11 years of the competition. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage in a navy dress Tatum had sewn and stood at the microphone for a long moment before she spoke. She said, "I would like to thank my mother, who is watching from somewhere I cannot see. My parents, Tatum and Garrett, who gave me a room with sunlight and a shelf with enough space to grow into. My grandfather, August, who has walked me to school every single day for 7 years and never once complained about the weather." She paused. She said, "And I would like to thank my guardian, who is not here tonight, but who taught me the most important lesson I have ever carried into any language. He taught me that words are not decoration. In the right mouth at the right moment, a word can save a life." 340 miles north, in the common room of a minimum security facility in central Pennsylvania, Rowan Gale sat alone in front of a television mounted above a vending machine. He watched a young woman lift her medal with both hands. He watched her smile at the camera with her mother's cheekbones and her own particular steady eyes. 2 quiet tears moved down the weathered lines of his face into the gray of the beard he had stopped shaving the previous winter. A passing inmate from Pittsburgh who owed Rowan nothing and remained cautious of him, regardless, saw the tears, registered them, and walked on without a word. Some things do not require comment. Some things are simply true. The gates of the Federal Correctional Institution at Allenwood, Pennsylvania, opened on a bright Thursday in April, and the air smelled of wet grass and new earth, and the particular freshness that belongs to mornings that are in the process of becoming something. Rowan Gale stepped through them alone, 49 years old. The silver that had begun at his left temple 10 years earlier had spread to a quiet, dignified gray across both sides of his head. He wore a simple, dark suit that Ledger Cade had sent the week before, a white cotton shirt with no tie, and shoes that felt strange after so many years of soft-soled prison issue. In his hand, he carried a single plastic bag, a Bible, a notebook of handwritten letters, a small photograph of a girl in a white dress holding a gold medal. At the end of the long driveway, 3 people were waiting. Tatum Brierly, her hair fully silver, now a cardigan over her shoulders, both hands pressed over her mouth. August Fenn, 77 years old, leaning on the same cane he had carried into an abandoned church on Staten Island a decade ago, his eyes already overflowing with something he had long since stopped trying to manage. And between them, in a pale yellow spring dress with a simple braid over one shoulder, stood a young woman Rowan almost did not recognize. 18 years old, her mother's cheekbones, her mother's height. The stuffed bear was not in her arms. She had left it on her bookshelf that morning, standing in front of it for a long time before making the decision, concluding that she did not need to carry her childhood into this doorway, that she was ready to walk into it as the person she had become. She saw him. She ran. The dress moved behind her. Her braid bounced against her back. She covered the 50 yards of driveway with none of the composure she had rehearsed the night before, in the mirror above the bakery sink, and she did not care at all that she had lost it, because composure was not what this moment was for. She crashed into Rowan Gale the way a wave crashes into a shore that has been wading through every storm without moving, because that is what shores do. Her arms went around his neck. Her face found the collar of his suit jacket. Against the fabric, muffled and fierce and containing 10 years of first Sundays and letters and handsets and half an inch of plexiglass, she said one word, she said finally. The plastic bag slipped from his fingers and hit the pavement, and neither of them noticed. His arms went around her and folded her in, and his shoulders began to shake with the weight of a grief and a joy that had been stored for 10 full years in a body that was not designed for storage and had been managing it badly regardless. He said into the top of her head, "Wren, sweetheart, you grew up," she said against his collar. "I waited every single day, just like I promised." 2 hours later, the 4 of them sat at the corner table of Tatum's Bakery on Mulberry Street, under the photograph of Tatum's grandmother that had watched over that same marble top for 60 years. Garrett brought out food and a bottle of wine that had been saved since the week of Rowan's sentencing. Nobody touched anything for the first 15 minutes because Wren was talking, and every person at that table wanted only to listen to her voice filling the room, the way it had never quite filled it when she was absent. Near the end of the meal, she set down her fork and reached into her bag and placed a single envelope in front of Rowan. Cream paper, a small wax seal, He looked at it, his breath caught in a way he did not try to hide. She said, "Open it." He slid his finger beneath the flap. He took out the letter inside and read it once, and then read it again. Then he set it down on the marble table and looked at her across it, and his eyes were doing something that, in a different life, he would never have permitted them to do in a public place. Harvard University, International Relations, a focus on peace negotiation and conflict resolution. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He said, "Your mother is watching. I know she is watching, and she is so proud of you. I am proud of you. More than any words in any language have ever been made to hold." Ren smiled at him. It was her mother's smile on a face that was entirely her own, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 49 years of looking at the world. In the year that followed, Ren used a portion of the trust to open a free language school in a renovated storefront 3 doors south of Tatum's Bakery. She called it the Celeste Hale Language House. It accepted any child from any shelter in the 5 boroughs who wanted to learn. Volunteer teachers from universities across the city donated their Saturday mornings. The walls were painted 4 colors, one for each major language offered. The shelves were full. The radiators worked. The door was unlocked at 7 every morning by a man in his late 40s who drew a modest salary, paid his taxes, fixed what broke, and went home at 6 in the evening. Each night after supper, the light stayed on late in the apartment above the bakery. Rowan sat in a worn armchair. Ren sat cross-legged on the rug beside his feet. They read aloud from a different book in a different language every week. Mondays were Italian. Tuesdays were French. Wednesdays were Russian. Thursdays were German. Fridays were Japanese, which neither of them had spoken before Ren decided they should learn it together, which meant they were equally lost at first and equally better by the end of every session, which Ren said was the point. Saturdays, they chose something entirely new, a language neither of them had touched, something they would begin knowing nothing and end the week knowing a little more than nothing, which is how all languages begin and how most good things begin, not with mastery, but with the willingness to be in the presence of something larger than yourself and to start anyway. The lesson they left behind is older than either of them and will outlast both. A word in the right mouth at the right moment is not a small thing. It is the difference between a door that stays closed and one that opens, between a life that ends on a pier in the dark and one that walks out into the morning, between a child who disappears into the machinery of a world that never learned her name, and a young woman who stands on a stage in Washington and thanks the mother who gave her the only armor that cannot be taken. Language is not decoration. It is the rope that pulls a lost soul back to the shore it did not know it had been looking for. And sometimes it lives in the mouth of a 7-year-old girl in an oversized coat with a stuffed bear and the courage to walk through the wrong door at exactly the right moment and say the truest thing she knows in whatever tongue the room requires.